Well, thank you very much for allowing me to make this presentation. What I really feel inside of me is just to say to you all that everything I prepared to say has already been said. I should just make you all think or imagine what I would say because you've already had most of it. Reclaiming aesthetics, African and Afro-diasporic philosophies of art and cultural expression. I couldn't have said it better than what the last speaker said. But let me preface my presentation with this. And I reworked what Audrey Hepburn had to say. The beauty of a person is not in the clothes worn, the figure that the person carries, or the way the hair is dressed. The beauty of a person is seen in both eyes because they are the doorway to anyone's heart. The place where love resides. True beauty is a person, true beauty in a person is reflected in the soul. It is the caring that the person lovingly gives, the passion shown at all times, and this beauty only grows with passing years. This, of course, was not the original. The original was actually addressing women. And I was telling somebody I was going to make a presentation. I was telling Chief Bolanle Austin Peters that I was going to have this presentation, and she just went on to talk about how the Eurocentric idea of beauty, has affected how Africans, especially women, see themselves. But the original, like you can see, talks about the beauty of a woman is not in the clothes she wears and all that. Well, if this was a gathering of 80% Yoruba people, I would simply have just titled this presentation, Iwa Lewa. Iwa is character, and Ewa is beauty. And the Yoruba idea of what beauty is stems from not what is seen, but the totality, and we shall get into all of that. So the African and Afro-diasporic philosophies of art are incredibly rich and diverse, which everybody has said in the last 2 days, and is deeply rooted in both traditional epistemologies, that is the science of knowing, and contemporary critiques of colonialism, aesthetics, and identity. This area is gaining serious traction in academic decolonial debates as artists and scholars push back against Eurocentric understandings of what art is, how it's valued, who gets to define it. So the questions that I intend to interrogate are, what is African aesthetics? If we talk about it, but what is it? Can African creative expressions be subjected to their own value judgments? This presentation explores African and Afro-diasporic philosophies of art, focusing on how these traditions offer alternative understandings of aesthetics, identity, and the role of art in society. I'll be drawing on philosophical, historical, and cultural perspectives. This presentation, as you would expect, should challenge the Eurocentric definitions of art and beauty by centering what Professor Molefi Asante calls Afrocentricity. And Afrocentricity is really not much of a critique, but a centering, looking at African creative expression from African perspectives. So the presentation considers indigenous African aesthetics rooted in practices that integrate the sacred, just like you heard now, and the utilitarian, and explores how Afro-diasporic artists have transformed artistic expressions into a form of cultural survival and political defiance. So let's get to the introduction as we move along. My main concern here, like I said, is to interrogate what Africans, on one hand, define as beautiful, and on the other hand, that definition has traveled over time to mean something different with Africans in the diaspora. Now, when people talk about Black, I usually, because I teach in America, I usually have to say, yes, you might look at us at the color of our skin, but our historical antecedents divides us into Africans that came from the continent, the Africans that were forcibly removed and are African Americans, and then the Caribbeans. And trust me, if there are Caribbeans here or there is anybody from the Caribbean listening to me, you would know that we see the world very, very differently. When I went to Trinidad and Tobago was when they really brought that home to me. The man I was to live with, his name was Ngozi Soyinka. Ngozi is a female name in Nigeria, and Soyinka is a male name. And I was at the airport getting overly excited that I was going to live with a woman until I saw a man. And they said, that's your business. For us, Ngozi is not a European name. It's an African name. You go on dividing Africa the way you like. So I have to bring in this very quickly so that you will understand that I'm looking at the bifurcation of Africans from the continent, either those who were born there and lived there and left, or those who have never been to Africa. And they are the ones I'll be referring to as Africans in the diaspora. It appears to me at this stage of my inquiry that African intellectuals define aesthetics differently from their brethren in the diaspora. Why is this so? And how can we explore a common ground? Just before I delve into the forest of a scholarship from both the West and the rest of us, let me state my entry point into this massive issue. Beauty, I was told, was in the eyes of the beholders. And I believed it for a long time until my postgraduate studies started. I was supplied with an alternative perspective that beauty is between the ears of a beholder. In a nutshell, what is seen is not what is evaluated, but the prior knowledge of how the culture in which the beholder defines what beauty is. 100 people could look at the same thing and they will come out with different perspectives. It is not what they're seeing. It is what they've been socialized to believe is beauty. And of course, I don't need to tell anybody that in Europe, if you're slim, you're figure 8, you are the model. In Africa, if you're slim, in most parts of Africa, let me say, especially the Yoruba people, if you are slim, they will think you're sick and that your husband is not taking good care of you. But if you're meaty and they actually adore you and think that you're beautiful. This is how the Yoruba people say it. Because the dance, the clothing, everything really privileges those who are meaty or voluminous. So that's just the difference. And it's not only the socialization, it's also the ecology. It's also the nature of a place that makes the women appear like that. And because they're not sedentary, they're constantly moving. So this fear of obesity, I don't think I would entertain it personally. In effect, there are 3 main pillars on which the presentation will find its bearing. It is my intention to challenge the so-called universal narrative about how African creative expressions have been evaluated/appreciated. As will be seen shortly, Eurocentric views have often presented the aesthetic principles. Example, the classical Greek ideals of beauty, Renaissance perspective, as universally applicable and superior. Asante Molefi would say, if I say classical music, I don't know anybody in this room who would think that outside of the German composers and all of that, that there's classical music, that Yoruba has its own classical music. Because we've all been socialized to believe that that is what it is. How do we get out of that? The second pillar is to decolonize knowledge and history of African creative expressions. For too long, African art has been viewed through a Eurocentric lens, e.g. primitive art, and the debate between African art is craft and European art is art. You know, African art has been viewed through a Eurocentric lens, that is, they call it the primitive art, source material for modernists. Understanding African aesthetics on its own terms is a crucial step in decolonizing art history and broader knowledge systems. Finally, promoting cultural equity and respect, recognizing the richness and the complexity of African aesthetics fosters greater cultural understanding, respect, and equity. It challenges the assumption of cultural hierarchy, since it may be termed academically disrespectful to share my own views with you as if others before me have not deliberated on the subject. Let me take a quick detour to share with you what others have said about the topic of aesthetics, its definition and application to creative expression. So I jump into literature review. When considering aesthetics as a Western concept, two names are prominent. One is Alexander Bogarten and Immanuel Kant, among many others. And long before that, you would see that the linkage between aesthetics and ethics, Plato had already deliberated. But I'm not a philosophy scholar, I'm a media scholar, but I think some of these names are necessary for those of you who are in that field. So, according to a very detailed analysis carried out by Professor Ernest Agoba in a paper that is not dated, the term aesthetics is traceable to Bogarten, like I said. He defined it as a lower theory of knowledge, as art of beautiful thinking, as art of thinking analogous to reason, is a science of sensitive knowing. In short, aesthetics is how humans perceive the world through our senses. The only limitation to that is that there are just five senses that the West privileges, you know, but there's that fourth dimension, which is the intuitive, which is what you would find me talk, speak and have a dialogue with my mom, and she would take a look at me and say, where did you learn that from? That is not the way it's not from school, it's not from talking, it's not from seeing, it is just one of those perceptive senses that any human being can develop. Since knowledge is cumulative, Immanuel Kant, in his monumental Critique of Judgment in 1790, significantly departed from the foundation laid by Alexander Bogarten in aesthetics. Even though Kant was familiar with and initially taught from Bogarten's work, the key differences lie in their understanding of the nature of beauty, the role of pleasure, the possibility of a science of aesthetics, and relationship between beauty and objective properties of concepts, end of quote. The Western definition appears to center the concept on individual judgment. You're looking at something, you and what you see is what the field, but we're going to move a little far from there. Sol Shava in 2015 argues that, I quote, African aesthetic embraces a rich variety of creative forms and styles peculiar to people of African origin that incorporate a combination of practical, physical, material, temporal, and spiritual aspects. End of quote. The inclusion of the spiritual comes into direct collusion with Kant's objective properties of beauty. How do you evaluate something that is spiritual? What are the standards for measuring metaphysical experiences? Is it a cop-out? Is it an escape? But Sol Shava, in the Sage Encyclopedia of African Cultural Heritage in North America, states that the term African aesthetics refer to the African perception and appreciation of the nature, beauty, and value of artistic expressions or representations of African origin. It is embedded in the plurality of African cultures and embodied in people's practices within their lived African social context. It draws from and is directly related to the diverse geographical, environmental, historical, cultural, religious, or spiritual experiences of African peoples. It is therefore a significant component of African people's tangible and intangible cultural heritage, just like we heard now. They simultaneously affirms their diversity and reinforces their cultural unity. You see, that's the thing, the beauty in diversity. And I think Sheikh Diop talked about the cultural unity of Africa. As diverse as we are, there's still the possibility to see a unity in that continent. It provides symbolic representations that communicate what is to be an African to future generations on the continent and in the diaspora. He goes further to state that, and I quote, most Africans in the diaspora have retained some of their traditional aesthetic elements, which are exhibited in their dress, their hairstyles, ornamentation, music, song and dance, and artworks. These various artifacts are symbolic elements defining and sustaining their identity and origin, end of quote. But long before Shava's encyclopedia entry, a conference of African Literature Association convened at the University of Florida in 1980 explored the definition of African aesthetics. A critical aspect of African aesthetics is the challenge to Eurocentric definitions of art and beauty and the establishment of a criteria for evaluating African aesthetic expressions on their own terms. You would see that I started off with the Western philosophers, and gradually, because they always say start from the known before you get to the unknown. Everybody here is very comfortable with the Western philosophers, and I guess we are within the master's house. We're not trying to use the master's tool to bring down the master's house. We're just going to rearrange the furniture a little bit so that when the master comes, they probably might not recognize that it's their own house. So most Africans, like I said, in the diaspora have retained some of these traditional things. But long before Shava's encyclopedia, that conference that I told you about, which took place in 1980, was where Chinua Achebe and Giles Baldwin, in a dialogue, underscored the interconnectedness of African and Afro-diasporic experiences. This dialogue between Achebe and Baldwin exemplified the recognition of a shared heritage and common struggles, suggesting that the aesthetics of the diaspora are fundamentally linked to those of the continent. Now let's go to a woman most of you will probably know. In 1989, Professor Nkiru Nzegu, in her 191-page thesis at the University of Ottawa, cerebrally investigated two main types of aesthetic theories. One she termed subjectivism, and the other one institutionalism. Both theories appear to take their intellectual roots from a series of Western schools, including philosophers such as Edward Bullough, Monroe, and so on. And so she also had to dip first into the Western philosophy. According to her, the subjectivists assume that the aesthetic experience is essentially inner or private, while the institutionalists assume that it is outer or public. In the thesis, she critiques both schools of thought and posits that, I quote, explanations of the character of aesthetic appreciation must take into account the manner in which formal qualities of an artwork, and I'm putting in my words, or any creative expression for that matter, are informed and shaped by contextual features, end of quote. So what contextual features did she have in mind? Features such as cultural values and worldviews, ritual and spiritual significance, social and political structures, artist intent and community interpretation, and indigenous aesthetic principles. As part of this presentation, her views on Ashe aesthetics as part of Africa's response to the practice of aesthetics will be articulated if time permits. And I could just quickly, Ashe Roland, there is a Professor Roland who had actually believed that when you look at an African piece of artwork, apart from the material itself, it has unseen qualities in it. Ashe is it's a power, a force within the material. And you know that everything in this room that you're either sitting on or writing on was once a living entity. If you're sitting on leather, remember that it came from an animal. Or you're thinking, oh no, I'm sitting on something that is created in the lab. That thing that was created in the lab is actually mirrored after something that is real. The wood, of course, comes from a living tree, you know, and we can go on, that the ones were alive. And this is the only way we can explain in the West to what we mean by Ashe, what somebody was saying, how you can activate the power within it, the force within it can be activated by incantation. Don't get scared because I mentioned the word incantation and that something can actually get activated. You do it all the time yourself. That you're listening to the sound of my voice simply means that the column of air between me and your ears is vibrating and there's an energy. And I have the power in my tongue to say something nasty that will depress you before the end of this presentation. I have such powers. And you also have the power as well. So it is, when an African says it, it always looks like it's mysticism. No, these things are there. If the voice in which I use for incantation is not the voice in which I will tell a girl, you know, I like you the way you are. I change my voice as well. We all do it. You don't use the same voice to ask your significant other to empty his bank account on you. You have to find the voice. And Africans, right from their childhood, have learned to do that. I grew up seeing one of the insects, and I would just stand there and I say, and it will stand still there. Is it standing still because of what I'm saying or the energy that is coming? So these are the things our brother was trying to explain, the force that are in these materials. Okay, so if I don't get into that, that is just briefly what she's talking about. And how do you evaluate that? Do you also put that into consideration when you're appreciating the art that you don't understand the culture in which it comes from? As expected, the definition of African aesthetics could not be monolithic, but diverse. It encompasses various cultures, languages, and artistic forms across the continent. In effect, African aesthetics perceives art not as a separate entity, but as deeply integrated into daily life, ritual, and community. There is the importance of the community and shared experience in shaping artistic expression and its reception. Implicit in the discussion of defining African aesthetics is imperative to decolonize the study of African art and literature, moving away from imposed Western frameworks and valuing indigenous criteria. If the truth must be told, the first time I met this idea of African aesthetics was in something I read from Professor Biodu Jefos. And I approached him, I think 2 or 3 months ago, to say that, where can I find this thing you were saying? Because he was watching a lot of Nollywood movies, and the reviews he was reading did not collocate with what he had in mind. How come there are no African aesthetic standards to look at these works? But good enough, people are beginning to do that. Later on in this presentation, a few examples of ritual and community creative expressions will be shared. Meanwhile, let us quickly delve into the examples of location-specific views of a subject. What I intended to say is such an elaborate thing, and it has to do with the Egungun and the Egungun Festival, which is almost art, is ritual, is spiritual, is everything. But have you asked yourself, to those of you who know about the masquerade and the Egungun, who are the costumiers that designed this? How is it funded? Have you ever read any proposal, somebody asking that we want to have an Egungun play and display? Can we raise funds from Western whatever to create this? But they're created, the families maintain them, but nobody has ever asked who the costumier is, or who the technical director is, or all of those things that you use, the choreographer. We don't even use such terms. But that's what if there's time and you're interested in it, I might talk about it. So let's go on to African perception of aesthetics. I'm just going to reel through some of these I've spoken about, and most of you know about them. There's the Nomo, the Dongon in Mali, which talks about the power of a spoken word, a creative force. The concept can extend to the voice or essence within artistic creations. In Southwest Nigeria, I've talked about the Ashe. It is the life force, spiritual power, and creative energy inherent in materials. It is the animating force in all things, including fine and verbal art. Roland Abiodun is a prominent scholar of Yoruba art and culture, and the concept of Ashe is central to his work. Ashe, the empowered word, must come to pass. That's what it means, it must come to pass. He has a chapter by that title in the book Yoruba Art and Language, Seeking the African in African Art. In this book, specifically in the chapter above, Abiodun delves deep into the Yoruba concept of Ashe, showing how it is not merely a philosophical idea, but a tangible force that permeates all aspects of Yoruba life, from verbal incantation, which is Oriki, praise name. But Oriki is beyond, when, God bless all Western anthropologists, when they want to flatten something, they just pick one aspect of it and chew on it as if that's the only thing. Most of the works, they say, oh, Oriki is about praise. No, Oriki is a lot more than that. To visual arts forms, he emphasizes the interconnectedness of language, thought, and artistic creation through the lens of Ashe. And then you can go to Ghana, former Gold Coast, Sankofa. We've talked about that yesterday. And don't think that it's just West Africa. Even in North African aesthetics are a fascinating blend of indigenous Berber traditions and the profound influence of Islamic art and philosophy. So if you turn to East Africa, the Maasai will be there and are renowned for their intricate big works where colors and patterns are not arbitrary, but convey specific social status, age, gender, and even emotional states. The precision, the symmetry, and the vibrant combination of all part of a highly developed aesthetic system. And of course, I also brought in the question of Ali Mazuri, who talks about cosmetics before aesthetics. Yes. So let's move on to aesthetics and Africans in the diaspora. I have just 5 minutes. The discussion of African aesthetics takes on the significant and unique dimensions for Africans in the diaspora due to their historical experiences, geographical separation, and ongoing navigation of multiple cultural identities. If I'm allowed to borrow from the previous day's presentation, in which Amiri Baraka was Leroy Jones, in his time. That name was evoked yesterday. It was in 1974 introduction to Dumas' work that he coined the expression Afro-Surreal Expressionism. The introduction can be found in Dumas' posthumously published collection, Ark of Bones and Other Stories. And you would see that the Black Arts movement were very much into the definition of African aesthetics as well. So let's quickly get on to, well, as we end it, reclaiming and reconnecting with a lost heritage. Here I have to, because yesterday this whole question of return really got me somehow. It must be explicitly stated that the word reclaim here has nothing to do with the return to the past. We are mindful of effects of forced displacement, dispersal, and disconnection. For many in the diaspora, particularly descendants of enslaved Africans, and I use the word enslaved Africans just to distance myself from people who say there was a slave trade and slaves were brought from Africa. Slaves were never, ever brought from Africa. They were enslaved. And enslavement is a process, and it is still ongoing. And that is why if you go to, I think, Bonn, they have what is called the strong awareness dependency theory, of which they look at freedom and unfreedom. And we can use that for as long as we care to explain what is happening. The situation has led to a massive genealogical and cultural search. This engagement with African aesthetics for diasporans often involves a deliberate search and reconstruction of cultural memory. Conclusion. Let me just run to the conclusion. And I say in lieu of a conclusion. Now is the time to supply answers to the questions we started with. What is African aesthetics? Can African creative expressions be subjected to their own value judgments? Even if I have not done justice to the topic of African aesthetics, it should be taken into consideration that African aesthetics is not a singular, monolithic concept, but rather a diverse and complex set of principles and practices that govern the creation, perception, and appreciation of art and beauty across the African continent and its diaspora. While there is immense cultural variation, several overreaching characteristics and values frequently emerge. The holistic and multi-sensorial engagement found in African creative expressions may not readily lend themselves to easy evaluation by critics in search of boilerplate kind of formula. African aesthetics embraces a rich, multisensory experience. Art is often not just something to be seen, but also heard in music and rhythm and speech, felt, texture, movement, and touch, and even smelled or tasted ritualistic elements, body adornment. The artistic aesthetic experiment is embodied, involving the whole person and the interaction with the art world and its content. Have I, in this presentation, explored African and Afro-diasporic philosophies of art? How have these traditions offered alternative understanding of aesthetics, beauty, identity, and the role of art in society? If I have drawn on philosophical, historical, and cultural perspectives, has this presentation challenged any Eurocentric definitions of art and beauty by centering African and diasporic worldviews in which art is deeply embedded in communal life, spirituality, resistance, and memory? The presentation set out to consider indigenous African aesthetics rooted in practices that integrate the sacred and the utilitarian, and explores how Afro-diasporic artists have transformed artistic expressions into a form of cultural survival and political defense. I was going to perform a poem I wrote, Abode of Fear and A Bowl of Fear. If there's time, I might go back to it and just read it to you to see how I've integrated the sacred with the secular and also brought in Christianity and all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting and prolific presentation. Meanwhile you were talking, we had a comment in the chat from Herman, who mentions a recent film called Omen, that he said can be worth a whole day of comments in this site on a conference like this. And he's also adding a question. I want also, as earlier we gave precedence to the online community, I want to first open the floor to the room here in Prague. Know if there are any questions. Otherwise, I will proceed with collecting the one that is already online. Then let's move to the question by Erman, who's asked about the enslaved Africans in the American and Caribbean diaspora has some ambiguity toward the continental Africans because the enslavement was also caused by the African self.
Yeah. Skip Gates, in his documentary, The Wonders of Africa, tried to sell that idea. And there's been a lot of, hue and cry between Skip Gates from Harvard University and the one Africa a Triple Heritage by late Professor Ali Mazuri. For both of them, one was trying to privilege Islam. The other was looking at how African Americans should relate to the past. And he brought in this, and you were the ones that sold us. But, it's always been called a trade. How could you, for God's sake, say that one umbrella, that brolly you have around, equals to 5 men? How can that be a trade? And we have a saying in Yoruba that Ajalata lo no. Who beat you that you are crying? The person who beat you is the one that is asking you that you are crying. They went there, right? And I think Nyerere was the one who put it best, that when the Europeans came to Africa, they came with the gun and the Bible in one hand, and the Africans had their land. By the time they finished praying, the Africans had the Bible, the Europeans who came had the gun and the land of the people. There is so much to be said about this whole business of who sold who. I wrote a poem called The Children of Those Who Were Taken and Those Who Did the Taking. We are all getting to a crossroad now. The children of those who did the taking and the children of those who were taken. We've reached a crossroad, and we have a common enemy. And instead of face all of that, we are dividing and asking ourselves. It was an epochal time in the life of Africa. The number that were taken, and most of them, the valiant of all the men, the strongest of them all, were taken, and something happened to the African continent itself. But that dialogue will go on for as long as we're not ready to sit at table with the Caribbeans, with the continental Africans, and the African Americans. Let us discuss. But like everything, we think that it will resolve itself with the years. The Madinka law. If you kill a man's father in a war, the son becomes your enemy. And that's what we're getting. We haven't resolved it.
Thank you very much for your answer. Are there further questions from the room? If not, before giving you a chance to perform your poem, I actually want to take the privilege, as I have already the microphone on my hands, to ask you a question. Because from yesterday, you have been one of the persons who most insistently remind us about the fact that African cultures, philosophies, ideas are a plurality. In your presentation, instead you focused on African and African diaspora as very broad categories. So perhaps concisely, to leave more space for your poem, why this choice?
Well, almost 3 times. I counted. Almost 3 times I said it was not monolithic, it was diverse, and that in that diversity there is unity. You see, it's like an elephant that is being described by blind people, and you can take the size, but I will maintain at all points that this totalizing and just that word, I find it sometimes very problematic to say African. And that's why I always switch it. When they say African languages, I say languages in Africa, and African literature, I say literatures in Africa. And I always would challenge the students in my class that is there an American literature? Is there an American music? in its diversity, but it projects it to the world that there is something so-called. And I think, every time we joke that Africa is not a country, many times that deep down to the Pan-Africanists, we actually wished we were a borderless country. But we don't want the West to tell us that. We don't want the West to say Africa is a country. No, for you, Africa is diversified. That's the contradiction in it. It's the truth. But we say it all the time. But we also want, because like I told you, Western anthropologists, when they get somewhere, they flatten the whole thing. They flatten it because they have a report to write. And you better be focused, or else they would read it and say you're all over the map. So they just make it look as if when one thing happens in one part of Africa, it happens in all parts of Africa. But as Africans ourselves, we really wish that something united us. But it's something that you would hear or say, because that, again, is one of the things that allows us in the academy here. We're never allowed to express what is important to us. If it's not couched in Western epistemologies and stuff and all of that, your supervisor is not going to allow you go. Now, I had a big problem when I was doing my master's. I was citing at the beginning, instead of citing Robert Chambers, who is known for participatory methodology, I was citing Murere, I was citing people, and they thought I was dumb. How could you not know about Robert Chambers? He's there in the background. Check him in the footnote. He's there. But he's not my concern. He's not the one that would dictate and allow me understand what this whole idea of participatory methodology is about. And I scored maybe 69 or 70. They threw me out, literally. That this boy doesn't know what he's doing. You are in the British supported your scholarship, and you are citing some unknown Kenyan names and stuff and all of that when you should be. And Robert Chambers is the one. He's gone to India, he's gone everywhere, and he's supposed to be the leader of us. But no, yes, he's a leader. I know. I've read it. But let him be in the backyard. And yes, I brought it up to say it's also the dilemma we face. We have to start with that, and then go on to Nkiru, and then go on to the Egungun and stuff and all of that, so that we don't lose our audience, or else people will just slip off because they can't identify with those names or those ideas. Now, how do you come to a Western audience and talk about incantation? What is the equivalent of incantation in the West? Anyway, I hear you. I hear we are all our bundles of contradiction. You say you want to listen to the poem.
I still have a few minutes.
Okay, all right, if you want to. And again, I'll tell you the truth. I submitted this for a competition. It didn't take them 3 weeks to just throw it away. This is not what we're looking for. You remember that I was one of those who was talking about the stream of consciousness and how you have to seek for the coherence within the stream of consciousness. And this is exactly what it is. And this is how the spirit medium would speak. It's titled Abode of Fear, a Bowl of Fear. Shango strikes with thunder, and the rivers respond with solid fear. My heart becomes the center of trepidation, where fear as king sleeps, or wakes to lecture me as I drip. Call Yemoja to rid me of this situation. Legs are shaking as heart's palpitation threaten my buccal cavity. On the way to the ghostly king's court, words here like frost, as if from a spirit pierced. I must unsheath the sword. If I must move forward, my uncaged bird can no longer be silent. How can Shango thunder in length when hymnals rent the air, and 40 days and 40 nights, the shield against arrows that fly? Fight for us who need spasms of grace. Spontaneity once more should take its space, and channels of rage will be drained quickly apace. Let no bitter God leave us a lingering stain. I know its lair, where shadows still, the valley's depth, where sorrow sleeps, a reign of terror, where wealth weeps, and futures pledged miseries keep. I, the son of Irinwole, where leopards leap, we are washed in the blood of 1,000 sheep. As I sleep once again, the heart, a brittle fortress, where fear's dark pronouncements never fail to tint a future pale and green, a shattered canvas to lament. I bring this lamp meant for appeasement. I bring this cola from the forest of Shagamu. This is no moot trial, but the account of an imprisoned soul, a wing outspread ready for flight. Liberty bursts, a moment's gleam, spontaneity in pure delight, drains rage cup in endless night. I am the knight of human rights, who dips in Yemoja's waters while singing the Lord's songs. What is my sin this Lent? And I know the dwellings of stain, where death's dark shadows ever remain, the valleys whisper, etched in agony, where the reign of fear will continue, the geography of fear. I know it well and beyond nation states. It is not a place marked on any terrestrial surface, but a reign in the intricate cartography of the self. There, in the very center of our emotional capital, fear establishes its citadel. It reigns, a sober oracle, pronouncing verdicts of futures irreparable shattered, a litany of coming doom. This fear is a tyrannical instructor, its voice a relentless, menacing whine, brushing paintings of tomorrow loaded with inexorable shadows of roads eternally broken. But even so, in this repressive rule, there's a spark of hope. Our hearts, like a rope, have witnessed glimpses with terror, like scepter recedes from the center stage. Let us expose fear to the page of death, so we can be healed and not killed. Lead me to where fear lives. I have the ability to pull out his eyes and stuff his ears with wool. Fear rules the fool's heart. Who lost the heart to fight? It's head on. I have since sold my fear. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll leave any further comment of a poem for later, so that in the interest of time, we get our next presenter. The floor is all yours. And now we have Ian Grekush presenting of one-child ethics in the paradigm of post-colonialism, identifying problems. Let's keep it up to 20-25 minutes, so that we'll also have time for discussion. Thank you very much.